took a deep breath. Perhaps he won't make a big deal of it. Are you crazy? Look outside. At the moment of the interrogation, Marshall felt frost clutch his spine as he turned to face the window. Journalists were already surrounding the station door. Infuriated with Marshall, the spaceman flicked forth the nearby radioactivity cable and pressed it against the window. The door to the room opened. The prosecutor's voice was calm, but underneath it was steel. "I suggest you find a good lawyer." Derek walked out, flanked by the lieutenant and the precinct chief officer Marshall. He took a business card out of his pocket and casually placed it on the desk next to a stunned Marshall. "Oh," Derek said, leaning slightly, "I will definitely be attending your hearing." No one could believe that a mere police officer had arrested the state attorney general, Sergeant Dan Marshall, who sat at the defense table with his face flushed with tension. Marshall was unable to speak as the man he had so carelessly arrested left the precinct. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions over each other, and in that moment, Marshall realized his career was over. The courtroom was lively like a beehive, with cameras clicking and spectators whispering about the scandalous case. Had been informed that this was merely a formality, but he sensed deep down that something was wrong. The doors opened and Derek Williams entered, immaculately dressed in a fitted suit. He strode slowly and dignifiedly, as though he commanded the entire room, and his presence alone was enough to silence even the most doubtful bystanders. "Sarge Han, we are here today for the case of the unlawful arrest of Derek Williams by Officer Daniel Marshall. Marshall swallowed hard. Prosecutor Williams stood. "Your Honor, I request that this trial be fully public and transparent. Let the people see how the system works." The judge nodded, and as the first piece of evidence was the arrest video, the court screen lit up. Marshall unconsciously tensed as Williams passed by and took his seat at the prosecution's table. The prosecutor's eyes met Marshall's, but they were cold and calculated, deplaying. The audience gasped when the journalists whispered that Marshall had demanded that Williams get out of the car without reason before handcuffing him. "Marshall, you said I resisted arrest. Do you think this video shows any resistance?" Williams asked, keeping his eyes on the officer. Marshall's throat dried up. "Well, not exactly. You made up the accusations." "I was only carrying out my duties," Marshall blurted out as soon as he realized his error, and the judge slapped the woman. "The truth is, Sergeant, you are a product of a system that has protected police misbehavior for years. Today, this courtroom isn't just weighing your fate, it's deciding the fate of thousands who have suffered from injustice." Williams resumed his speech in the courtroom without wavering. An hour later, the judge delivered the ruling officer, and Marshall clenched his fists, but said nothing. "Marshall, you have been placed on leave, and a criminal case for abuse of authority has been filed against you." Marshall sensed the earth. It lost without even looking at him, disappearing beneath him. Williams stood up and left the courtroom. The scandal had only been going on for 2 weeks when Sergeant Dan Marshall sat in his smoke-flared apartment, staring at the TV. Police, the racist arrest of the Attorney General, and the anchors said, as his face appeared next to Derek Williams' son, he muttered, reaching for a bottle of whiskey, He believed that the system would protect him, but once the case became public, everyone turned away. The following day, his badge was no longer used at the station. "Sergeant, you're suspended." And the receptionist avoided his eyes. "You know this is politics, Dan. I was just carrying out my job duties." The police commissioner and attorneys were waiting for Grace at headquarters. "You are being investigated internally, Sergeant Marshall." Marshall let out a breath. Commissioner Williams shook his head abruptly because of that damn Williams. "We looked over your previous complaints, infractions and video proofs. You attracted too much attention, Dan, and we can't ignore it any longer. You're trashing me like trash. You're poisonous, and the police need a new image. Marshall experienced the disintegration of his universe. After 20 years of service and youth, the system no longer protects you from charges. If you rise this system, you will fail to track the charges if you expect. A week later, he was accused of using excessive force, fabricating reports, and engaging in systematic discrimination. His attorney, Dan, was direct and said, "This is serious. Plead guilty. Take a deal. You'll get probation, but lose your badge forever." "I won't plead guilty." The attorney then slid a phone across the table on the screen. Marshall said, "They're always hiding something to keep them scared. This is a setup, Dan. There will only be consequences." Public cameras captured Marshall's fists clenched every second of the trial, which resulted in the eventual verdict. The gaze of the crowd. Everyone stood when the judge arrived. Daniel Marshall was found guilty on all counts by the court, barred from law enforcement, and given a 3-year probationary sentence. The crowd clapped and murmured, and Marshall stared at the floor after losing. The worst part was that Derek Williams watched him in the hallway, happy and content, but without any anger or triumph. "Now," Marshall growled, "justice has won," and Williams repositioned his handcuffs. "The system didn't break Marshall. It just doesn't function for you anymore, Sergeant." He left Marshall with his broken handcuffs. Outside, reporters' delusions rejoiced over justice triumphed.